Hi, I'm Liz Proffetty, the owner of Neighborhood Clay, and welcome to my new show, The Neighborhood Potter. I'm a potter, and I am interested in teaching you to learn about pottery. At my studio at Neighborhood Clay, we do classes for all levels and all ages on the wheel and hand building, and I also have some paint your own pottery, as well as I sell my own work, which is called Liz Proffetty Ceramics. This is my work, Liz Proffetty Ceramics. I work with porcelain clay and many different glazes that I've made myself. The colors and the textures are inspired by the coast in Maine. I have functional work. For instance, there's lots of mugs and bowls and wine cups and teapots. And I hope that you would come in and enjoy collecting them as much as I enjoy making them. And I'd like to introduce my apprentice, Sarah Simmons. I couldn't do it alone without her. She helps me teach classes, keep the place running smoothly, and she is a wonderful potter all in her own right. And over here are the wheels, the pottery wheels where all the fun happens. We can accommodate up to 9 students throwing at the same time. So if you're interested in having a private party or birthday parties or just not worried that you won't have space in class, don't worry, we have the space for you. So I get the clay in bags. They actually come in 50-pound boxes, and there's 2 of these bags in the boxes. These bags each weigh 25 pounds. And I have in my studio several different kinds of clay. So all of these little bags over here are open bags of clay. Some of them fire to a more of a buff color. Some of them fire to a dark black, brownish color, and some of them to a tan color. The clay that I use fires to a pretty close pure white. That's what I mentioned before is called porcelain. And when you open a bag of clay up to take a piece of clay out, you use something called a wire cutter. And you slice a piece of clay off of it. It slides really nicely through the clay. And then from there, the clay has to be sort of woken up and wedged, as we call it. When it first comes out of the bag, it's a little stiff, and by moving the clay around, it not only wakes the clay up and softens it, it also helps me get out any air bubbles and to mix the clay up so that it's the particles are evenly distributed. This process is called wedging, and in other episodes I will show you more about how this technique is done. There are more than one way to do it. I like to call this one the ram's head. It kind of takes on a face of a ram, or sometimes people think it looks like a monkey. And the clay has become much softer in my hands now, and it doesn't appear to have any air pockets going around. And so I would, from here, take it and sort of pound it into a really good snowball. When I start to throw on the pottery wheel, I want my clay to be round. So it doesn't make sense to start with a piece of clay that's not already round to begin with. Back here in my own studio space, I work on a different kind of wheel than we have in the classroom. My wheel is a combination of a kick wheel where I can use my feet to control the speed and the flow of the wheel, as well as a gas pedal with electric assist that will help it keep it going fast for me. I enjoy the process of working on this wheel because I have the ability to use the wheel in either direction, and sometimes when I'm working and I'm just want to go nice and slowly, this wheel really helps me. This wheel was originally called a Lockerbie. I believe the company is no longer in existence, although this style wheel is still offered by different companies. I've owned this wheel for over 30 years, and it's been a real workhorse for me. Okay. And today I'm just going to show you a little bit of what I'm going to have in store for you in coming weeks on how to throw on the wheel. I'm just going to show you the basics of how I begin to make a mug today. And I think you're going to find the process of watching the clay come up on the wheel just as fascinating as I do. So the first step is to throw the clay down on the wheel and make sure that it's stuck down tightly. And then I'm going to center the clay. A lot of students struggle with this part, so a lot of times if you've ever tried to throw pots, you will hear people say how difficult it is to get clay centered. It's definitely a technique that takes a little practice and time. Ultimately, our goal is to get the bumps out of the clay so that it's spinning smoothly in your hand. I can tell that it's centered if I just quietly hold my hands on the pot or the clay and it's not wiggling around. So the next step I'm going to do is make an opening. You can start by just throwing my thumbs down into it, like this, and then I'm going to pull open a bottom. My first form that I'm going to make is just going to be a simple cup shape. I like to teach how to make a cylinder or a cup as the first object, although it's actually very tricky for students to get the clay to come up straight. It's essential to learn how to throw a cylinder. It's the basis to making pitchers and vases and of course mugs. So using the compression between my two fingers, inside and out, I'm slowly squeezing the clay and taking it up. My goal is to get the clay thin enough that it won't feel heavy later on, but not so thin that it will collapse on me as I'm making this piece. I'm working in a very difficult clay body called porcelain. It's known for its rubbery quality, so I have to handle the clay a little slower and more gentle than you might with a clay that is a little more easy to work with. I'm using a wooden tool now to cut away this extra clay on the bottom. When I make mugs, I like to keep the bottoms fairly straight and simple, so I don't want to have any extra clay on there, and I don't want to have to go back in later to take out too much. This tool is a metal rib. I'm going to use it to start to smooth the surface and get rid of some of those lines that I made by my hands that I don't want to show up. But it's also going to help me to create a form by bending, the way I bend it and move it in and out. I never make two mugs the same, but I do find I'm attracted to mugs with a nice curve or belly on it. So I tend to make a lot of mugs that are that shape. As far as sizes go, I like my mugs all sizes. This one will shrink some, but I imagine it would hold a fairly good sized cup of coffee, probably about 12 to 14 ounces later on. I'm cleaning up the bottom, and I want to make sure that I don't leave any water in there, because any extra water in the bottom of your mug could cause cracking. And lastly, I want to make sure that I address the rim. This is where our mouth goes, so it's really important that it feels good on our lips. I like to make sure that it has soft, clean edges. And then my mug is done until later when I go to put a handle on it. But that has to be done when the clay is a little harder, at a stage we call leather hard. This pot was thrown on a wooden board called a bat, so I can lift this pot up and move it onto the shelf. So here's some pots that I threw earlier, and I have left them covered under plastic so that they would dry slowly, but not all the way dry. What the stage that I'm looking for is called leather hard, and it's when the clay is soft and still somewhat pliable. You can sort of see it move, but it doesn't leave any fingerprints. At this point, it's ready for any kind of attachment or further decoration that I want to put on there. So first thing I'm going to do is just clean up my bottom. Sometimes with some forms, I put them on the wheel and I use a tool to trim off extra clay, but on my mugs, or on this mug, the bottom looks quite nice and the proportions look good. There's not a lot of extra clay. So I'm going to just soften this edge so that it will sit nicely on someone's furniture, doesn't scratch anything. And then I like to just tap the bottom just a little bit so that as it dries, if there's any shrinkage that could possibly cause this to bow back out, sometimes a pot can get a little wobbly. So by just tapping it, I'm helping to sort of keep that from happening, and I'm also helping to compress the clay, which with clay, compressing the materials, the particles in, will keep things from cracking. So this mug is ready for its handle, and I am going to show you how to make a handle. I have made some here a few minutes ago. Usually I like to make if for whatever number I've made, I usually like to make about 10 to even 20 handles out ahead of time, and by the time I've made that, then I can come back in and they'll be just dry enough, as I talked about before, to not be leaving a fingerprint. So these I made a short time ago, but I'm going to take you through the process of how I'm going to make it. So I'm going to pinch off a piece of clay off of a bigger chunk, and that really doesn't have to be too big. This is just a small mug. So I'm just going to take the clay in my hand and I'm going to start to sort of roll it into a sort of coil shape. And as I roll it, I want to start to think about it being tapered on one end, like a carrot. And then I'm going to use the table to sort of further roll this down. And I like to try to get a nice even roll, but sometimes you get little like crevices like this, but I'll smooth them out in a moment. Take my time getting the shape that I want. This end is getting a little thin, so I'm just going to take it off. I don't want it to be too thin down there. Okay, so now that I have this sort of carrot-like shape, slightly tapered on one end, I'm going to just start the next step of kind of flattening it out. So I want my handles to sort of be a little bit flat on one side and the other, but have a thinner profile this way. I like to think about this profile as relationship to the profile of the rim. So I want them to sort of resemble one another. So if this was very, very thick, it might look odd next to a thinner lip. If it was very, very thin, likewise. All right, so now the next part is where we call pulling the handle. And this is where a lot of people struggle with making handles. And I actually like my clay to be very, very soft when I'm working with it. So I don't do a lot of pulling, but the way it works is we get the clay wet and we just start to gently, and I think that's where people go wrong, very gently start to just slide our hands down the edges of the clay. I like to sort of start on one side of the handle and work with my thumb pressure across it, and then I'll rotate it to try to get more even pressure. Our hands are not perfectly symmetrical, so if I kept it all in the same direction, it would start to get kind of crooked and funny shaped. So I'm just slowly sliding and kind of compressing with my hands to add some pressure and thin out that profile. And that is about where I'm going to leave it. But then what I'm going to do is I personally, like I said, I don't like to pull too much because the clay gets too soft fast. And I don't always enjoy the marks that my hands leave behind. So the next step I do is I put it down on a canvas cloth and I just pat it with my sponge. And I'm paying attention to the edges along here and here. And when I pat it, I like to say the pressure is about the pressure of a finicky cat. So it's a very gentle, very light patting that I'm doing to sort of make sure that I have a nice even shape. Now, I might pull it one or two more times just to make sure that it's smooth, and then I'm gonna let it set for a bit. I tend to trim off a lot of the extra clay down the edges because if I just let them sit around and dry out, then it's just more clay for me to work with, dry out and recycle later. So now here are my handles drying, and I'm going to start with the one here that's had time to dry. So in order to attach two pieces of clay together, you need to do something that people call score. Sometimes I just call scratch. This is my scratchy tool. Lots of people just use a needle tool to make many, many marks, but I love this serrated rib. And I am going to just scratch at the clay where I want this handle generally to be attached. And then the top and then the bottom. When I'm putting the handle on, I'm already starting to consider the shape of this mug. So depending on what kind of shape I have here, depends on how long, how far apart I might make these, where I might make it attach. If I'm using a mug with more of a curve like this, I might push the handle up a little bit so that in this indent here, the curve is kind of exaggerated in there. And it's sort of, I like the idea of it looking like it's coming right off that curve, but this is a little bit more of a straight-sided mug. So I'm gonna I'm gonna spread the handle out a little bit longer. Now, that's the scratching. The next part is to add slip. This is my slip. So my slip is a combination of basically the same clay that I use, and it's just dried out pieces of clay that I've added water to. And I do actually add an additive called Darvan 7 that is a deflocculant, and it helps to make the clay a little bit, I like the fact that it makes it a little bit more creamy because I also use this sometimes in decorating on the surface to get texture, but it also helps create so that there's less water needed to attach the handles. And when I'm working with this porcelain clay in particular, the less water, the more likely we have a crack. So it really is important to use this Darvan. I get a lot better results. So all I'm going to do is I'm going to paint some of this slip onto the clay pot, and then I'm going to get that handle that is already dry, and I'm going to start to sort of work with it. Now, I want my handle, you have a choice when you're attaching handles. Some people like to put the bigger part up top. I like to put the bigger part down on the bottom. So I'm going to start to take a look at how that's going to go on. So I'm just going to trim off again a little bit of this extra. And then I'm going to make this space in here a little wider so it has a little more room to attach. I'm just using the back of my fettling knife. This is called a fettling knife. It's a clay knife that's used to cut clay, but it is very dull. It doesn't cut people, so it's quite nice that way. And I just kind of widen that out. I call them suction cups, or sucky lips. So now it's going to sit right on that spot that I slipped. And I'm just going to get this part up and out of the way for a minute, and I'm going to take a moment to make sure that it's attached. I like to leave some of the evidence of where the handle's been attached. I like the look and the line that it creates, but at the same time, I don't want it to look messy. I don't want any of those scratch marks to be left behind. And I really don't want the handle to fall off later. So I really do take a moment to make sure that everything is joined in and smooth. And then, once I think I have what I like, I'm going to turn this handle around and start to sort of look at this profile and the placement of where this is going to go. This end is going to get cut off, so I want to just make sure I leave enough clay that I have a nice handle that's going to fit comfortably in your hand, keeping in mind the fact that this clay shrinks 15%. So if I make this handle very, very comfortable right now, it could be too small later. So I need to sort of estimate how that's going to feel. I'm going to just trim off this extra clay in here. I'm going to turn this to look directly at it to make sure that I'm putting it on straight. That would be kind of unpleasant if it was crooked. And then I'm going to do the same on the top with smoothing it out. And I'd just like to pull this handle up. You see, you might be able to see up close that little bit of slip oozing out of that crack. I actually like to see that as evidence that I've really attached it well, and that it's starting to make a bond in there. And I want to smooth this part out. I don't like there to be a bump that's sitting on your hand and making it uncomfortable, but I do like to have like a little notch where your hand can rest in there. So there's always a lot of debate around who makes the most comfortable handles. I do try to make my handles both a combination of comfortable and visually interesting. So I do take my time on that. And that is the handle of a mug. And now I have, which I won't make you sit through, the rest of my mugs to make. So you can see the amount of work that can go into just making one mug. So, and this is only the beginning. Now it still needs to be glazed, fired and glazed a couple of times in the kiln. So it's got quite a long road ahead of it. And this may look like a mess, but what this is a pile of different tools and stamps that you can use for decorating your pottery when you're done making it on the wheel. Adding texture to your pots can make it uniquely your own and really help bring out the glazes that we offer. You want to take a peek at my kiln? This is the piece of equipment that I use to fire the pot in. They go in here twice. The first one is the bisque firing, and that's where you saw the clay that had no glaze or shine to it go in and come out white. And then from there, I'm going to put more colors on it, and they'll go back in a whole nother time and come out shiny and done, like the work you saw on my shelf. As I mentioned, this mug that I made earlier is going to be getting a handle on the side, and then it will finish drying on a rack like these have here. This is a cup that didn't get a handle. It's called a wine cup, and it is in the totally dry stage. I can tell it's dry by holding it in my hand, and it has a warm room temperature feel as opposed to a piece of wet clay that feels sort of cold from the evaporation process. It takes on a sort of a dull noise when tapping, and you can kind of tell that it's not been fired yet. Once these go into the kiln, there's two firings that they need to go through. The first one is called a bisque, and when it comes out of the bisque, the clay has changed chemically, and it makes a louder ting noise. So this pot here has been bisqued. This is the glaze kitchen, as I like to call it. We have several different kinds of glazes, many that are made here in the studio, and students have their choices of about 15 to 18 different glazes that can be layered and placed on top of the clay. We also have numerous tools when you take a class here. The tools and equipment are all included, as well as all the firing. Thanks so much for joining us. I hope you enjoyed it. And next time we'll talk more about all the things that we do here at Neighborhood Clay. For more information about the studio or classes, you're welcome to check out www.neighborhoodclay.com.